What if one of the most unexpected diplomatic moments of our time didn't happen in Washington, Paris, or London, but in Ouagadougou? Earlier this year, on a quiet morning, something unusual took place. Liberia, Africa's oldest republic and long considered America's closest ally on the continent, made a subtle but powerful move. Instead of looking west across the Atlantic, it turned inward. Its foreign minister traveled across the Sahel, not to the White House or the Elysee Palace, but to meet Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. And that decision carried deep symbolism. Here was a nation, historically tied to the United States in identity, currency, and political structure, choosing to seek dialogue with a landlocked country often portrayed as unstable and struggling. This was not just a visit. It was a signal. A quiet but powerful indication that Africa's political direction may be shifting, away from long-standing external influences and toward new self-defined partnerships. But the question remains, was this the first real sign that Africa is redefining its own path? Or simply a desperate attempt by Liberia to find new solutions? To understand the weight of that moment, we need to look closer at Liberia itself. Because Liberia is not like most African nations. Founded in the 19th century by freed African Americans, its roots are deeply connected to the United States. Its flag reflects that connection. Its institutions were shaped by American systems. Even its currency is tied to the US dollar. For decades, Liberia stood as a strong Western ally on the continent. But behind that historic relationship lies a more complicated reality. Its economy remains relatively small, just over $4 billion in GDP. Growth exists, but is fragile. Heavily dependent on aid, remittances, and a narrow range of exports like rubber, timber, and iron ore. And while more than 60% of the population is under the age of 25, opportunities remain limited. Official unemployment figures don't tell the full story. Many young people survive through informal work, low-paying, unstable, and offering little chance for progress. Frustration has been quietly building in Monrovia. Despite repeated promises of foreign partnerships and development support, daily life remains challenging. Electricity is unreliable and expensive. Hospitals struggle with limited resources. Schools are overcrowded. Infrastructure development has lagged behind expectations. And that raises a difficult question. How can a country so closely aligned with a global superpower still face such persistent challenges? By 2025, this contradiction had become impossible to ignore. A new generation began asking harder questions. If other African nations are exploring independence and self-driven development, why should Liberia remain dependent? If sovereignty is becoming a priority elsewhere, why hold on to old models? At the same time, something new was emerging in the Sahel. A region once dismissed as unstable began to take a different direction. Under Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso started transforming, not just in rhetoric, but in action. Together with Mali and Niger, it formed the Alliance of Sahel States. This alliance began renegotiating resource agreements, removing foreign military presence, and focusing on building internal capacity in security, agriculture, and energy. For Liberia, the contrast was clear. On one side, a long-standing relationship with Western powers that had delivered limited transformation. On the other, a new African-led model focused on self-determination, despite its risks and challenges. The choice was no longer about stability versus instability. It had become a deeper question: dependency or sovereignty? And that is why the January visit to Ouagadougou was not just diplomatic protocol. It was something far more significant. It wasn't just a visit. It was an admission. A quiet recognition that the Sahel itself might be emerging as a new center of African political influence, no longer foreign capitals. And that raises a deeper question. Was Liberia's move toward Burkina Faso a sign of weakness or a glimpse into Africa's future? a future built on internal strength rather than borrowed systems. To understand this, you have to look at what Liberia was searching for and what the Sahel was beginning to offer. Before Liberia surprised the world by turning to Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso had already shocked observers by standing firm against the odds. Just a few years earlier, analysts in Western capitals had written the country off, labeling it unstable, dependent, and unlikely to rise. But by 2025, under Ibrahim Traoré, that narrative began to change. One of the biggest factors behind this shift was security. For years, extremist violence destabilized the Sahel, even with foreign military presence in the region. Yet insecurity continued to grow. Then came a turning point. Traoré removed foreign troops, reclaimed large portions of territory previously held by militants, and introduced the Patriotic Support Fund, an initiative that allowed citizens, businesses, and communities to contribute directly to national defense. Hundreds of millions were raised. But more than the money, it represented something deeper: ownership. It showed that security and dignity could be built from within, not outsourced. For many across Africa, that message resonated. The second factor is resources. While Burkina Faso's official economic figures may appear modest, the reality beneath the surface tells a different story. The country is a major gold producer and part of a region rich in natural resources, including manganese and energy potential. Together with Mali and Niger, it forms the Alliance of Sahel States, a bloc with access to vast resource wealth. Gold from Burkina Faso, uranium from Niger, oil potential from Mali. Combined, these resources could support regional development and industrial growth if managed effectively. For a country like Liberia, which has long depended on exporting raw materials like rubber and iron ore, this model presents both an opportunity and a necessity. The third factor is energy. Across Burkina Faso, solar energy projects are steadily expanding, bringing electricity to areas that once had little or none. While these installations may seem small compared to global standards, their impact locally is transformative. They represent a future where energy is generated internally, using Africa's own natural advantages. For Liberia, where a large portion of the population still lacks reliable electricity, this example is hard to ignore. But perhaps the most powerful element isn't physical, it's symbolic. For decades, African leaders spoke about sovereignty, but very few demonstrated it in action. Traoré's administration began taking concrete steps, investing in local training, renegotiating resource agreements, and redirecting national priorities. The process hasn't been perfect. It's complex, and at times uncertain, but it is undeniably homegrown. And in a continent where young people are searching for authentic leadership that matters, what started as a military alliance has evolved into something more. The Alliance of Sahel States is gradually becoming a political and economic force, one that suggests Africa can define its own path without external approval. For Liberia, the message was clear. These nations were showing that poverty is not permanent, geography is not destiny, and sovereignty can be built, not just discussed. It's no surprise then that leaders in Monrovia began to see Burkina Faso not just as a partner, but as a reflection. A reflection of a choice Liberia itself must make: remain within the familiar system, or step into a new, uncertain, but self-driven future. And when Liberia's foreign minister finally sat across from Ibrahim Traoré, the conversation moved beyond symbolism. It became real. With their different geographic realities, but a shared desire for dignity, what could these two nations actually build together? That question found its answer in a series of bold proposals, ideas that surprised both supporters and critics alike. Because when they met in Ouagadougou, this wasn't a courtesy visit. It was a negotiation about the future. When Sarah Basselo Nyanti stepped into the modest presidential residence of Ibrahim Traoré, she came prepared. not just with diplomatic greetings, but with proposals that could reshape cooperation across Africa. The first proposal carried strong symbolic weight. Liberia sought support from the Sahel Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, for a rotating seat on the United Nations Security Council. But this wasn't just about diplomacy. It was a statement. A signal that validation should now come from African nations themselves, not from Washington or Brussels. For Ouagadougou, this was significant. It showed that even Africa's oldest republic was ready to look inward for legitimacy rather than outward. The second proposal focused on one of Africa's biggest economic challenges: access to the sea. Liberia offered its Atlantic ports, Greenville, Buchanan, and Monrovia, as gateways for Sahelian countries. For landlocked nations like Burkina Faso and Niger, this could be transformative. For decades, reliance on external trade routes has led to delays, tariffs, and political bottlenecks, costing billions. Now, Liberia was proposing something different: a Sahel Atlantic Economic Corridor. A direct link connecting inland Africa to global markets for gold, uranium, agricultural goods, and manufactured products. Analysts believe such a corridor could unlock over $15 billion in annual trade. For the Sahel, it means breaking isolation. For Liberia, it means becoming a strategic bridge between the ocean and the interior. The third proposal addressed security. Having experienced its own history of conflict, Liberia understands the cost of instability. It proposed hosting an AES Liberia Security Summit in Monrovia. The goal: to coordinate intelligence, strengthen border control, and reduce the massive economic losses caused by conflict and insecurity across the continent. For a country once seen as firmly aligned with the West, offering its capital as a hub for regional security cooperation marked a major shift. But the most ambitious proposal went even further. Liberia suggested a new approach to financing development. Instead of relying on institutions like the IMF or World Bank, African nations could mobilize their own resources through regional banks, diaspora bonds, and sovereign wealth funds. The message was simple, but powerful. Africa can finance its own future. For a country historically tied to the US dollar, this idea was nothing short of revolutionary. Reactions were immediate. Some critics dismissed these proposals as unrealistic, questioning how countries with limited budgets could execute such bold plans. But others saw something deeper: a shift in mindset. After all, initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area already point toward a massive economic future. Regional trade corridors, local financing, and African-led security systems are no longer just ideas. They are becoming necessities. And perhaps most importantly, these proposals resonated strongly with the youth. Across Liberia, young people rallied, calling for a future built by Africans, for Africans. To them, this wasn't just about trade routes or diplomacy. It was about jobs, opportunity, dignity, a chance to build a life at home instead of risking everything abroad. Of course, this path is not without risk. Aligning more closely with the Sahel could strain relationships with traditional partners. It could disrupt existing economic ties. But continuing the same cycle, without change, was no longer an option. And so, as the sun set over Ouagadougou, the message from that meeting echoed far beyond the room. Africa must begin investing in itself. This wasn't just an agreement. It was the beginning of a new conversation. It was still just a theory. And despite how bold the agreement sounded, one question refused to go away. Could these nations, often described as fragile and struggling, actually deliver on such promises? Or would this moment fade, like many before it, into empty words? Maybe the real answer wouldn't come from politicians or military leaders, but from the youth. Because while leaders speak in meeting rooms, the true energy of a nation lives in its streets. And in Monrovia, that energy erupted. On April 30, 2025, the city came alive, not in protest, but in something closer to awakening. Thousands of young people filled the streets, their voices rising through the humid air, chanting one message: Africa for Africans. But what shocked observers wasn't just the size of the crowd. It was the name they were chanting. Not the IMF, not Paris, not Washington. It was Ibrahim Traoré. For the first time in decades, the youth of Liberia were looking toward the Sahel, not across the Atlantic, for direction. And that shift matters, because this is a generation shaped by hardship. Civil wars in the 1990s and early 2000s left deep scars. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, nearly 1 million displaced. Foreign peacekeepers came and went. Aid programs started and ended. But unemployment and underemployment remained high. Today, young people make up over 60% of the population, and many are still navigating between survival and uncertainty. So for them, dignity isn't an abstract idea. It's the difference between staying and leaving, between building a future at home or searching for one abroad. That's why Liberia's move toward Burkina Faso struck such a deep chord. Because suddenly, the narrative was changing. From waiting for help to building with what already exists. Ideas like economic corridors, regional security cooperation, and African-led development funding stopped being distant concepts. They became possibilities. If the Sahel could attempt it, why not Liberia? Across universities in Monrovia, students began speaking out. Open letters described Traoré as a symbol of hope and dignity. Dozens of student organizations called for stronger ties with the Alliance of Sahel States, arguing that Africa's future lies in unity, not dependency. And the conversation didn't stop there. It spread across the continent. In Accra, Lagos, Dakar, and Freetown, young people joined the discussion online. Hashtags like Africa Can Rise began trending. Students in Ghana examined how Burkina Faso renegotiated mining contracts. In Nigeria, discussions emerged around creating regional payment systems to reduce reliance on foreign currencies. In Senegal, youth groups shared messages of possibility. If they can do it, so can we. For a generation long excluded from global decision-making, this moment carried deep meaning. It suggested that progress didn't have to depend on outside approval. That innovation, dignity, and sovereignty could come from within. From belief, from courage, from collective effort. But not everyone was convinced. Some warned that youthful enthusiasm can be fragile, that slogans can move faster than real institutions. Others argued that Liberia, given its economic position, could not afford to risk upsetting long-standing international relationships. Still, on the ground, the shift was undeniable. For many young Liberians, this wasn't just politics. It was opportunity. And perhaps the biggest change was psychological. For the first time in a long time, Africa itself began to feel like a place of possibility. A place where futures could be built, not escaped from. Where cooperation, not dependency, defined progress. But the question remains, can this energy be sustained? Can it turn into real, lasting change? Or will it collapse under pressure, like so many movements before it? The answer may not depend on Liberia alone, but on whether other African nations are ready to take the same path. Because every shift in Africa's history has faced resistance. And this one is no different. The move didn't go unnoticed. In Western capitals, it sparked unease. Policy circles in Washington and Paris quickly reframed the Sahel Alliance, not as a bold step toward independence, but as a dangerous slide into instability and authoritarianism. Media narratives followed the same direction, portraying Ibrahim Traoré and his allies as reckless figures, despite the fact that their support was rooted in popular mobilization, not foreign backing. The message behind this shift was clear. If Africa began solving its own problems without external oversight, long-standing systems of influence could begin to crumble. And beyond the media narratives, there were hints of more tangible pressure. Analysts warned that countries aligning too closely with the Sahel bloc could face quiet consequences. Tightened trade conditions, reduced access to loans, or delayed aid packages. Some European think tanks even projected the potential impact if African nations redirected tens of billions of dollars away from Western markets toward intra-African trade. At that point, the stakes were no longer just economic or political. They became existential. But history shows that the most effective way to weaken African unity isn't always external pressure. It's division from within. Colonial-era fault lines still exist. Coastal versus landlocked nations. Anglophone versus Francophone blocs. North versus South. While many saw Liberia's outreach to Burkina Faso as a bridge across these divides, others warned that old rivalries could easily be reignited, especially if fueled by outside interests. Even within Liberia, opinions were divided. Some elites, long aligned with Western systems, were hesitant to pivot toward a Sahelian partnership they once dismissed as unstable. Their concerns were real: fear of economic retaliation, or even exclusion from global financial systems. And within the Sahel Alliance itself, challenges remained. It's one thing to unite people around resistance. It's another to build strong, transparent institutions that deliver real improvements in jobs, education, and healthcare. Still, one reality could not be ignored. Liberia, America's oldest ally in Africa, had turned toward Ouagadougou. That single image disrupted decades of assumptions, and no amount of criticism could fully erase its impact. Yet the central question still lingers, like a storm on the horizon. Will this fragile shift survive the pressures of division and external influence? Or can the collective will of ordinary Africans, young people, workers, farmers, thinkers, hold it together? History suggests that the answer won't come from speeches in government halls, but from everyday choices made by those determined to keep this momentum alive. And so we return to the image that started it all. Liberia, once firmly tied to Washington, now knocking on the door of Ouagadougou. It challenges everything we thought we knew. It suggests that Africa's direction may no longer be decided in distant boardrooms, but within its own capitals. It points to a deeper truth. Sovereignty isn't something handed over. It's something claimed, often in the face of resistance. For Liberia, this shift is more than diplomacy. It's generational. It's cultural. For Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel Alliance, it's more than symbolism. It's a chance to prove that resistance can translate into real progress through infrastructure, through education, through jobs. But this path won't be easy. Every move toward independence invites resistance. Power structures will push back. Doubts will rise. Divisions will be tested. The real question isn't whether opposition will come. It will. The real question is whether Africans themselves will continue to believe in unity, whether those willing to build will shape the future, or whether dependency will remain the default path. And that's where this story turns to you. Will Africa's future continue to be decided elsewhere? Or will Africans step forward to invest, to create, and to believe in their own potential? Because the continent has what it needs: the resources, the youth, the resilience. As Ibrahim Traoré often emphasizes, those who choose unity will lead. Those who depend on others risk being left behind. So here's the question. Is this moment the beginning of something bigger, or just another passing chapter? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and stay with us, because this story is only just beginning.